Tolan serving as chair of this committee. Let me start by taking the roll. President Masterson.
Here.
Speaker Reichman.
Here.
Secretary Burns-Wallace.
Here.
Mr. Orman.
Here.
Mr. Pickard.
Here.
Mr. Rolfe.
Here.
Okay, we're all here. Thank you, everyone. So I appreciate everyone making time to squeeze in one last Spark committee meeting before the holidays. I hope you received the meeting materials that were sent yesterday. Heading into the new year with a new Spark director and with our advisory groups having been appointed, the hope for today is to clear the deck of some items that are pending from our work that's occurred this summer and fall. In our listening sessions, we heard clear direction from Kansans on needs and opportunities that are more immediate. And I think the question is between doing some good now or waiting to do the same good later, we've got an imperative to try to act now. So with that in mind, we are bringing for your consideration 3 investment opportunities in the areas of economic revitalization, education, and connectivity. Just kind of as a refresher, back in September, we agreed as a committee to allocate up to $500 million by the end of this calendar year. And if this request is approved today, that will bring the total amount that we've allocated to $261 million. That would include the $50 million that we did a couple of months ago for nurse retention, $27 million for testing extension, and the $30 million for the 24/7 pay plan. If you recall, the state started with $1.6 billion in discretionary funds that were allocated through ARPA. There was the $500 million set aside for the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, which takes us to $1.1 billion to be allocated by the committee. This would leave us, if the proposal in front of us is approved today, $839 million unspent of that $1.1 billion. So vast majority of these dollars are still here to be taken through the advisory group process. And I would note that if that second $250 million isn't needed by the UI Trust Fund, that would also leave additional dollars to be invested by Spark much later next year. I will not, as chair, be bringing any additional agency funding requests to the Spark Executive Committee until the advisory groups have made their recommendations to us next year. This is the last train out of the station. The only exceptions would be if there were an emergency that none of us could have reasonably foreseen, and also noting that we do need to extend our contract with the consulting team in January so that we can keep the operations of Spark running. So to take you through the proposal that is in front of us today, it's there to address immediate needs, including $100 million that is proposed for economic revitalization. This is specifically for investments to support spec building development, modernization of business park facilities, and other key economic development infrastructure and investments that will allow us to retain and attract businesses to our state. We can get more into the details of that, but that's the high level. The second proposal is for $50 million in education learning loss grant. This is for kids that fell further behind during COVID because of a lack of access to traditional educational outlets. What it would do is provide direct grants of $1,000 per child to low-income families to purchase educational materials to offset the learning loss of these kids, to get them brought back up to speed where they need to be so that they can excel academically. We'll get more into that in a few minutes. And then the last item today is $4 million for connectivity, broadband, for the Connect and Learn initiative. This initiative provides funds for school districts to use alongside the FCC's E-rate program to invest in high-speed broadband. This is about leverage. It's really a great opportunity to leverage new federal dollars to support the expansion of broadband service to school districts across the state. And so with that high-level overview, I'd like to open it up for discussion from the group and start some conversation here.
Hey, David, this is Ty. Lieutenant Governor.
Yeah, Mr. President.
The only one I didn't feel like I had enough detail, really, the educational piece. So is there an RFP process that's going to go on? There'll be multiple vendors on how. What I'm trying to figure out is what slice is somebody else going to get, a third-party vendor versus the kid getting the 1,000, right? And the benefit of when making sure that the bulk of that money goes to the education of the child and not to project management, if you will. Did you have any more detail you can provide us on that?
I'll talk at a high level, and then hopefully Secretary Burns-Wallace can jump in here. So, the intent is to empower families to be able to make the right educational decisions for the unique needs of their kids. We know that, what might work as a strategy for one child, one child may need a tablet. The other child might need, some really advanced tutoring, for example. And so rather than try to have a one-size-fits-all approach, the idea is to empower those families to make these educational decisions about what's best for their kids. Secretary Burns-Wallace, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. To give you, I would say a couple of our neighboring states or states throughout the region have done similar programs. Oklahoma and Idaho are probably the most well-known and established to date. And what we've seen, there are a couple of vendors out there that are kind of in that online marketplace where that would allow for the families to go in and kind of use a digital wallet for pre-approved material supplies, technologies, ebooks, as well as to register any of the courses, services, or educational services that they would want to use the dollars for. What we've seen, and I'm looking at data from Idaho in particular, their administrative costs are just under 5% for the vendor that they use. There can be application fees, but it looks like you can set it up in a way where those application fees are not, where they're like somewhere between $15 and $50, but that you could, so that it doesn't impact the family adversely in the way that they've been set up. So that's what we've seen. And again, the nature of this program, it's when you provide the vouchers, there's a set of parameters of kind of where it's broad, but still identifying where and how the family can utilize the dollars with various, you do use a vendor that allows the families to go in, certify themselves as eligible, and then to see all of the available ways that they can use the dollars in various places. And many of them are, vendors and entities that you can use, every day, from a Staples or an Office Depot or Scholastic, which has large access to books and other educational materials. But we've also seen models where it can be used for hardware or software, adaptive learning devices, tutoring services, educational services. And again, you use the platform where a family can easily go in, certify themselves, and then be able to access their dollars in a certified way. Does that help? But again, Idaho's administrative costs look like they're just under 5%, not quite 5% of their total program cost.
Yes, I think that's helpful. I'm actually a big supporter of empowering parents, and I think this is a step in that direction. So, but I didn't know if it'd make any sense to set some type of maximum fee parameter, or do we just hamstring ourselves? If you set a maximum, that's what everybody charges, right? So I just wanted to make sure the bulk of the dollars, went to the child.
And I would say the way that, we would approach it is to make sure that there are only a couple of vendors in this space, but there is more than one. So it allows us to do some competitive comparison in that space. And because there are a couple of other states that have already done similar programs, my understanding is it's also, when you're first out the gate, it can be a little bit more expensive, and they've streamlined some things. And so we may be able to benefit from their learning to get a better administrative services a little bit more tightly a cost. So.
Thank you.
Senate Governance, this is Speaker Reichman. I have a couple questions.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, I don't know if this is for you or the Secretary. We talked from the material we received, there's going to be 50,000 of students that can receive this money to the families. We know we have almost half a million kids in the state. Over half of those are about free and reduced lunch. And so how are we determining who receives these funds, and then how do they receive them?
I'll take it at a high level, and then Secretary Burns-Wallace can take it from there. So our intent is to get these dollars to the most at-need, at-risk kids. They're predominantly low-income kids in our state that have been disproportionately impacted by the challenges created by COVID and their ability to go to their classroom last year, or if they had connectivity challenges from their home. We want to try and make sure that we're taking care of those kids. So that's the intent. It's the most at need, most at risk children. And Secretary Burns-Wallace, can you take it to a more granular level?
And try, so again, as we've seen with kind of other models, a couple of things that would come into play. So you do use a kind of a verification process, which includes tax returns for both of the models that we've seen that have worked the best, which allows us to help identify kind of those appropriate populations that we're trying to target. And again, the designs that we've seen is that you actually set up where the families can go in and they can certify themselves. And then once they are certified, found eligible, it would allow them to then access their dollars, and it would show them all the various ways that they can utilize those dollars, including being able to use the portal to get to pre-certified vendors and entities and materials to help them move the process along. But it still gives them a flexibility of choice so that they can choose the materials that best fits their children's educational need. So it'd be like a maybe a platform is probably the best way to describe it. It's not a process by which we are cutting individual checks and sending a check out. It's a process by which individuals that believe that they fall into, based on the parameters that we publish in terms of the low income qualified census tract areas, that they would apply, check for their eligibility, then they would get access to their dollars through that portal, which allows them again to make sure that they're using it the way as provided, so that no one is misusing or mishandling funds, or even in an accidental way using them inappropriately. So that's the design of what we see. Does that answer your question, Speaker Reichman? Or tell me if you want to tell me a little bit more, and I can try to provide additional detail.
Started to answer part of my second question, but the question I'm asking is, how do we pare down almost 500,000 kids to 50,000? I know it's income based, but if we go free reduced lunch, that's about 250,000 kids. So how do we break down the 250,000 free and reduced kids to 50,000? Is it a maximum income of per family of a certain dollar amount you have in mind? If someone is listening to this program, this meeting right now, I thought, boy, I can use this money, I want to have an idea if I could qualify. So that's the first question: is how are we picking the 50,000 students? I understand it's income based, or it's part of the qualified census tract areas, and I'm not really familiar with that even means, the QCTs. But in addition to that, is it a 10,000 median income? Is it a 50,000 median income? Do you have a target? Because obviously it sounds like it's just income based from what I understand, how we're going to pare our free and reduced kids down to these 50,000.
So the way that we've seen the models, I think what we would try to do is target that using kind of those pre-established levels of lower income, free and reduced lunch, below what we've seen is ideas like below the 185% of the poverty level based on adjusted gross income. Again, some of that is triggered by, categories that are already there. So we can use things that are pre-established to qualify individuals. And then what I will say is that what we have seen again in other states is dollars have been used and expended on a first come, first served basis in that grouping of identified as eligible and allowable.
So you anticipate it'd be some percentage off of poverty, and that would be the first group of folks. How are we going to determine what that number is and what that first group of folks that we're going to go offer this assistance to? Was this all to be determined later?
I think as we build out that program design and use kind of the expertise of our Department of Education in conjunction with partners like the Children's Cabinet, they can, because there are some of these markers within their spaces that are already used. And so not to create new fictitious ones, wanting to align with what I would say those markers that already are set up within the educational system as kind of that lower income trigger. That would be that first cut of eligibility. And then again, once we identify where that is, as we build out that program design, then you would layer that onto the requirements for being able to verify within the system. And at a certain point, there is a reality that around the dollars that we have to allocate, you wouldn't be able to cover all, but it would have to be in a way in which once you've identified the group that is eligible, then within that group, that all of them would be able to apply, but then it would, I would say on that first come, first served basis through that. But I would rely on our experts in the Department of Ed with partners like Children's Cabinet to help us finalize the nuances of the actual program design to make sure that we, again, aren't creating new triggers or new levels and using things that are already established within their system. And that's something that I think if this is something that the committee has an interest in kind of tentatively approving in this way and trying to get this moving, we could definitely share that back based on their recommendations from those entities, if that would be helpful.
It is, and sounds like we'll get this information before this eventually goes to State Finance Council. The other is kind of the question you were answering earlier is what vendors and what programs do we know can qualify? I can buy a computer, I can buy internet access, I can buy a math tutoring program online. Is there a list of things out there? And I know in some of the meeting material you see that there can be people can apply to add to it. How do we know what this money's going to go for?
Yep. So again, the good part of being able to partner with and kind of work with some of our peer states who have done this, what we are seeing in the programs that they've been able to offer in matching up with their vendor partners, their portals have actually been able to provide an extensive list of different resources. So we are seeing through the online marketplace vendors that they're using as the kind of open up to that portal, everything from different types of educational materials, supplies, hardware, software, books, both ebooks as well as hard books. We're seeing adaptive learning devices. And then there are also the way, particularly IDEO has set it up, they've set up a way that through the process, a person can identify a course, a tutoring service, or an educational service, even therapies or licensed daycare during work hours that could be made eligible. And just like systems like when I'm thinking of like, our when you do your healthcare reimbursements for a childcare, you would certify the individuals that would be paid for those services have to be an entity that is designed for those services. And so the platforms allow the families to be able to identify which of those vendors are, what they fall into, to be able to make them eligible for the payment of those services. And again, because there are a few states that have been working in this space and a few vendors, we have a couple of different models of how we can shape that to allow for both those, the resources that are kind of traditional in terms of books and materials, but also create a space again through that portal that allows that family to identify, I have these tutoring services. This is the entity that is an entity that does tutoring. They are a company or an individual that I am paying. You submit that receipt, and then that qualifies it to be able to be covered. And so again, we're not starting from scratch, which is very helpful. And again, we've also been talking with those other states to learn their lessons learned as they've tweaked their programs over time to make them more effective and easier for families to access the various different levels of both materials and services. Many of that, there's a huge number of vendors I know in that Oklahoma has used. And again, I mentioned vendors that are just well known, right? So that can be an Office Depot or a Staples or a Scholastic. So it's not as if these are like entities that people have never heard of or special places to buy. It's places where you would typically buy certain types of supplies and materials. So it makes it both easy for people to recognize and understand, but that pre-qualifying of different items and vendors make it much easier for that family to know, yep, I can do this, I can get that. And it's more of a, I don't want to say complete point and click, but that's the intent of it. Does that help?
But it sounds like there's a lot of choice for our parents, and they can help decide what's best for their kids and empowers them.
Yep. I think that is the design, and what we have heard most strongly from both Oklahoma and Idaho is that there has been high utilization, and that the flexibilities for families to choose the materials that best fit their children's need has really been a strong piece of this program.
Lieutenant Governor.
Yes, Mr. Orman.
So a couple of things. First, last meeting when we discussed 24/7 pay, I think I made it perfectly clear that I wasn't going to vote yes for something that was sprung on us at the last minute again. And this is something we've just seen as of 5:30 last night, and we're expected to make a decision about it at 9 o'clock the following morning. And so just fully upfront, I'm a hard no on all of this, and I will tell you why I'm a hard no. First, if we look at what you suggested, which is we've done these programs, we've done this listening tour, we've been to 3 parts of the state, we've gotten feedback. I've got over 30 pages of notes from those discussions. Nowhere in there did I see someone say we need to be able to build a bunch of empty buildings to drive economic development in the state of Kansas. So I think the idea that we're somehow basing this on what we heard in those listening events is not intellectually honest. It's in fact nowhere in there were any of these programs discussed. It wasn't discussed in any of the preliminary materials that we received when we identified where the areas of need are. And so the idea that somehow that this is part of a process that led us to this point, I think is inconsistent with what's happened. I'd also suggest as we look at economic development, I spend a fair amount of time in commercial real estate. And I will tell you honestly, the idea that the state is going to somehow renovate a bunch of old buildings for the private sector, in my mind, is cronyism at its best. We're talking about corporate welfare here. We're not talking about anything that's going to have a real impact on anybody other than that developer who now gets the benefit of all those additional dollars, either upgrading their building or ultimately allowing them to build a new empty building that in theory is going to attract businesses. And you've got to know better than anybody that an empty building isn't what attracts businesses. It's workforce. It's the ability to look at the natural advantages that a state has and see how that fits with your business. And so I just look at this as cronyism at its best. I'm just shocked that we would come out and say we want to do an economic development program to build empty buildings. And I'll also tell you, if we're talking about a business that's big enough to need its own building moving to Kansas, they're making decisions about where and when they move far in advance of the timeline that it would take to build a new building if that's necessary. So, look, I just, again, the process, as far as I'm concerned, has not been followed. None of what we've done to date has informed this. We've gotten no information about it. And if we want to talk about the program, the $1,000 voucher for consumer electronics, which is what it sounds like to me, I think there are far better ways for us to help deal with the learning deficit that kids are having because of some of the policies that we've enacted around schools in the pandemic. Have we considered summer learning programs? Have we considered summer reading programs? This feels to me like we want to, again, we might as well send an absentee ballot with every $1,000 voucher that goes out. And again, it feels like we're buying votes here and not actually focusing on the real problem. So I'm a hard no. I don't have any questions that I need answered because, candidly, I'm not going to vote yes for $154 million based on what appears to be about 150 words of explanation, $1 million a word, and very limited time to consider it and no detail. So.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Orman. So just a couple of points I'd make. First, I appreciate that you acknowledge that I should know best about economic development because as Secretary of Commerce, this is what I do day in, day out. And we're very close to the pulse of what's happening. And I'm sure since you're involved in commercial real estate, you're aware that the shortage of ready to go, available, particularly logistics and distribution space, advanced manufacturing space, this is what is in most demand right now in the marketplace when we talk to site consultants and when we get RFPs, whether they're national RFPs or international RFPs. Companies are looking for space that is ready to go. We don't have that space in most places in Kansas. There is an acute shortage of it. So the idea is that we don't want to miss out on these economic development opportunities that are here and that are real and they're immediate. Because we don't have the product that the private sector, that the marketplace is looking for. And so the idea behind these grants is to address that. Our deal flow at the Department of Commerce, we had 140 projects in our economic development pipeline when I started in 2019. We are at 273 as of right now. Our deal flow is at historic highs. We've had tremendous success on the economic development front. And so because we've got this momentum right now, it's critically important that we throw some more logs on the fire to keep this progress going. And so the idea here is that through a public-private partnership, we can keep that progress. We can continue our economic development success. We can continue to grow the tax base in our state. And by making these one-time investments. And so that would be my point there. I would just categorically reject the idea of cronyism or some sort of favoritism. This is about making long-term investments in economic development. And on the learning loss vouchers, that's about empowering families to do what's best for their kids and recognizing also that time is of the essence. These kids lost a lot of learning time at key points in their brain development, and timing matters. And so to the extent that we can aggressively now get dollars out to these families so that they can make the best decisions for their kids based on the needs of those kids, I think we're doing the right thing.
Well, and I appreciate both of those points, but I'd point out a couple of things. Number one, no transparency to where we're spending the money on economic development. So you just want $100 million that you can decide to spend anywhere you want, or you and Lieutenant Governor Tolan can, or you and other members of the committee can sort of in back rooms make those decisions. No transparency as to how the money is going to be invested. Are we going to be owning these buildings? Are we giving grants to the private sector to build buildings? Again, there's just no transparency to this. That was not the process that we wanted to go through as far as I was concerned. I thought we were going through a process where we were going to look at different investment options and we were going to make decisions by comparing and contrasting. And Speaker Reichman, you said it yourself, for everything we say yes to, we're saying no to something else. We don't even know what we're saying no to. And in terms of the loss that kids, the setback, I agree entirely that we have an issue with learning in this state based on the policies that we've pursued over the last couple of years around education. I agree we need to deal with it. But at the same time, we've had nothing to compare this to. This is just $50 million out the door to be spent on things like consumer electronics. And we're assuming that it's going to be spent in the best interests of our kids because parents are making those decisions. I get that. I actually find it ironic that the administration's looking to Idaho and Oklahoma for policy advice. My suspicion is we could look through a range of policies there that would suggest this isn't the bastion of innovative policies either. I understand the appeal. I understand the political appeal of sending $1,000 to a bunch of people. I just, again, think this was sprung on us at the last minute. It's not clear to me that it's well thought out. There's no data or evidence to support any of it. And I understand you want to get money out there. I get the reasons for it. But again, I'm a hard no.
Okay. Just to respond on your point about what would the structure on the economic development side be. So if this is approved, the Department of Commerce will issue a request for proposals on how businesses and communities would spend these dollars. Those proposals will come in, they will be scored, and awards will be made based on that scoring. No, the state will not be building buildings for economic development. These will be public-private partnerships that are done through that competitive scoring process.
Mr. Lieutenant Governor, I would also like to echo my concerns on this proposal, given that we've just now received it, and just the lack of clarity and specifics in terms of how it's going to be spent. I think that there's a real concern about moving forward, particularly with the education piece. I was just, while we were on this call, looking at the internet, and it looks like the Oklahoma project is about a $7.5 million project or program, providing $1,500 grants to 5,000 families, not kids, 5,000 families. And Idaho is about a $20 million grant program, neither of which are being funded out of their fiscal recovery funds, and they're being funded out of other buckets of ARPA or CARES money that are specifically dedicated to education. And so for $50 million to come out of the fiscal recovery fund for this program seems inappropriate to me. If other decisions need to be made in the other buckets, then I'd say let them figure out where to get this money. But on the economic development piece, I certainly trust your judgment. I trust the work of the Commerce Department. I think you guys do a tremendous job. But at the same time, I just don't see the specifics that I would need to see in order to get comfortable with a proposal like this. I've got the same concerns about putting money in people's pockets without adequate venting and making sure that we're doing the right thing. And so I'm against it as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pickard. Other comments or questions?
Just one clarifying question. I want to make sure I understand it right, because we're saying one thing. We're not sending out $1,000 check to the household to someone that qualifies for this, and then they go spend it if they want to on the approved things. This is, I think I heard the secretary say it's a credit that's available on some kind of portal to be able to spend on this kind of thing. I mean, I know that's kind of parsing where it goes, but I want to make sure that I understand this right. We're not sending $1,000 checks out to people. Is that right?
Go ahead, Secretary Burns Wallace.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, could I get a motion on the round one funding request?
Lieutenant Governor's tie.
Mr. President?
So, and I understand a lot of the concerns around it, and I know there's a lot of workings behind it. I do appreciate your commitment that nothing else comes this way until it goes through the full process. I also appreciate the fact that if there are dollars not needed in the UI, that will also come back to us. And I assume also any reimbursement from FEMA, which we discussed, will also be back in this pot as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and make the motion to approve.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. We have a motion. Is there a second?
This is Secretary Burns Wallace. I second.
Thank you, Secretary. We have a motion and a second. Discussion on the motion? Okay, hearing none, I'll call the vote. President Masterson?
Aye.
Speaker Reichman?
Aye.
Secretary Burns Wallace?
Aye.
Mr. Orman?
No.
Mr. Pickert?
No.
Mr. Rolfe?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Motion carries. Thank you. Second item on our agenda is the Gear 2 authorization request. Secretary Burns Wallace, would you like to walk us through this, please?
Yes. So at the request of the Kansas Board of Regents, you have a background document describing their Gear 2 funding. As it laid out, Gear was initially created under the original CARES Act, and the state received 26 million in Gear funding in 2020. And then an additional 11.7 million came in under HR 133, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, in January of 2021. And so as is laid out here, the way that Gear works is that there has to be priorities set around it. These dollars were allocated to the Kansas Board of Regents under the first Gear and were sent directly to the Kansas Board of Regents when Gear 2 provided additional funding. They then provided their spending priorities, which were approved by the governor's office back in February. And at this time, as they have not moved forward yet with spending these priorities, the Kansas Board of Regents has requested spend authority for the 11.6 million of their Gear 2 funds. So I can try to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Secretary. Any questions from the Executive Committee on this Gear 2 request? Okay, hearing none, could I get a motion, please?
Make a motion that we approve this funding.
Okay, Mr. Rolfe, the motion, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, seconded by Mr. Pickert. Any discussion on the motion? All right, call the vote. President Masterson?
Aye.
Speaker Reichman?
Aye.
Secretary Burns Wallace?
Aye.
Mr. Orman?
Aye.
Mr. Pickert?
Aye.
Mr. Rolfe?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Motion carries. Thank you. Had one item that is not on the agenda, but would like our Spark Director, John Paralisi, to give us a brief report on next steps as we look into 2022. So, John?
Sure. Over the last couple weeks, I've been quickly getting up to speed, meeting a lot of the principals involved. I've also been working on the integrated project plan from now until the end priorities are determined by the Spark Committee. Iterating that, about the third iteration this week, should have something to be able to vet with everyone this week. In terms of the timing of that, the goal would be to get the advisory panels moving in mid-January. For each one of them to have a process with a heavy amount of support through the rest of January, February, and into March in order to identify the more narrow list of priority areas that they would recommend moving forward on, ranked to the Spark Committee. The Spark Committee then would be focusing in the March-April timeframe in terms of setting integrated priorities across those lists. So, and if there are any areas, the advisory panels would still be engaged to the extent that, you know, once we've identified the where, there's going to need to continue to be work around the how you're exactly going to be addressing each one of those areas. So don't necessarily see that the advisory panels would totally disengage once they hand their initial recommendations over.
Excellent. So advisory panels will start middle of January.
Yes.
They should wrap up their recommendations to the executive committee by the end of March, but will continue to be available as we conduct our deliberations in April and beyond. Is that correct?
Yes.
Wonderful. Questions for Mr. Paralisi? Yeah, Mr. Rolfe?
And forgive me if I'm missing this, but are we going to create a web portal, you know, prior to that process where people that have their requests can go put them in? I get a lot of people asking me where they should be submitting these things.
Yeah, as part of the planning that we've been doing against this, we want to have a common intake form and take all of the ideas that have been generated to date and put them in those forms, but also create a way for people to be able to submit as well, but do it in such a way that we capture the information that's going to help us for prioritization's sake.
Okay. And then also, do you have a target date for that to be out? That'd be out by the middle of January, maybe? Or
no, we've identified that as a need, but haven't gotten into detailed planning around it. But we would need to get something in place around that period of time as well. Yes.
And then, John, what's your thought on helping this be a dynamic enough process where what comes through the committees isn't fait accompli by the time it gets to us and we're just a rubber stamping group? But what's that interaction like between those groups and this group or along the way? Do you have a thought on that?
I mean, I don't think anything is going to be agreed to until the Spark Committee looks at the aggregated list and decides. I think the goal would be for it to be an iterative process in terms of being able to go back to the advisory panels. The other thing is, I think that some of the members had mentioned an interest in potentially even being able to attend some of the advisory panel meetings. Certainly open to that if that's what people are interested in doing. But did I answer your question, or did you have something much more?
Yeah, I think so. I just know this group has talked about. We just want to make sure we don't. We just don't serve as a rubber stamp, essentially, with the process, and just making sure it's dynamic. I think you understand that. We've talked about it before, but I thought, see if any, you know, as you're defining the structure, if you've had any thoughts around that.
Yeah, you know, the thought would be that the advisory panels, I mean, there are going to be an awful lot of ideas that they work through, and they're going to need to kind of funnel their list down to something more specific, more prioritized. But then when the aggregated list across the advisory panels comes forward, there are going to be more opportunities and ideas in there than can be funded, most likely. So it's going to be totally in the hands of the Spark Committee in terms of where to set the priorities.
Other questions for Mr. Paralisi?
So, John, just to sort of restate what I think I heard you say, fundamentally, you're going to come up with a list of potential investable projects through the advisory panels. You're completely open to the idea of Spark Committee members participating in those advisory panels. And ultimately, the list of investable projects will likely surpass the amount of investable capital we have. And so it will be the job of the Spark Committee to sort of make the decisions about where those where the capital goes in the context of those available projects. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, the only caveat I'd give to that would be we're going to need to get into the process in order to understand in each one of the areas what level of detail we get to in terms of investable project. You know, are we talking about a general area, and here are, you could go about it in one of three ways, right? And it might be at a later point that there would need to be approval around the specific direction taken on a priority area.
What a couple of thoughts that I had that might be suggestions for how we incorporate the Spark Committee in this process. One is I'd suggest having a couple of what we would traditionally think of as progress reviews, where you come in front of the Spark Committee and you say, here's where we are to date. Here are the things that we're considering, so that the committee can provide direct input and feedback, and maybe even course correction. The second thing is, you know, and I think you and I have had this conversation, I do think we have to have some understanding of what level of analysis is going to be done before it gets presented to the Spark Committee. And so, you know, at those progress reviews, we might be in a position to look at things and say, you know, for us to consider this, we really need to understand the following half a dozen things.
Sure.
And that might provide some guidance and inform your work. So that ultimately, if there's a big area of investable potential, but one where, you know, there's some questions about whether or not it will really have the impact, you can get that information sooner rather than later. And then we don't feel like we're making a decision basically in the dark. So again, I think those are a couple of things you might consider in your process.
Good idea.
Can I ask a question of Secretary Burns Wallace? And it has to do with the third-party consultants that, as I understand it, we're going to be asked to approve additional fees for later, maybe in January. Is my understanding correct that 100% of the third-party fees being incurred for the ARPA funding are being paid for out of the fiscal recovery funds?
State your question again, Mr. Pickard. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Are the fees for the third-party consultants being used in connection with the ARPA funds being completely funded out of the fiscal recovery funds? Or are we only paying the portion of those fees that relate to the fiscal recovery fund consulting services?
So the third-party consultants, the various consultants that we have, because we have more than one, are being paid for out of ARPA funds. And also across this fiscal, there are also CRF funds that also pay for them, as we still support pieces of CRF. Is there a nuance there? I want to make sure I'm answering the question. So remembering that there are pieces that this team, the various teams, different teams do in relationship to this process, but also the overall management of the state dollars in relationship to the relief dollars. Is that?
Right.
So
my question is, as I recall, there was about $20 million in fees approved for the third-party consultants, and I understood that that was the entire contract, and that was 100% funded out of the fiscal recovery fund. Is that accurate, or are other funds paying for a portion of those third-party fees?
So those third-party fees are paid for by both CRF and ARPA dollars.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the fiscal recovery funds, the specific.
You're talking about the discretionary dollars.
Right.
There are a portion of it is out of the discretionary dollars, not all of it.
Well, I guess I would ask John to take a look at the costs that we're incurring on the third-party consulting fees, and make sure that the monies charged to the fiscal recovery fund really relate to the services rendered to the fiscal recovery fund, and let the other funds pay their fees as they're incurred.
And we will work with John to make sure, and he has actually worked with them directly, and so we'll have a sense of it. What I would ask this committee to remember is that these dollars are not just the Spark process, because some of the support that they provide is also around how these dollars move, both the management as well as the federal compliance of these dollars and all of the necessary reporting around these dollars as well. So the Spark process is one piece of it, but there are other administrative pieces that various of our contracts do support. But we will work with John to lay that all out and have him give you all his feedback on what aspects are being utilized. And then maybe between the two of us, we can answer additional questions as we go forward.
Thank you.
Are there any other items that members of the executive committee would like to bring forward before we adjourn? Yeah,
I'll
Mr.
just
Rolfe?
make a suggestion for John. I noticed he's growing a beard there, and kind of like playoffs. I think if you made a promise to all of us right now not to shave until we got through this whole process, that could be pretty enjoyable for everybody to celebrate at the end. If you're up for that.
Well, since you guys would have to suffer through looking at me through the whole process, I think it may be more onerous on you than on me, but think about it.
I'm just kidding.
Okay, well, I want to thank the executive committee for its service this year and for the work yet to come. It's been a productive path that we've taken today, and I'm grateful for progress. And I want to wish everyone very happy holiday season, and we will see you again in 2022. Thanks so much.
Merry
Happy
Christmas,
New Year.
everyone.
Merry Christmas.